The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the immaculate grounds of Greenway House, where the annual St. Mary Mead Garden Fete was reaching its genteel crescendo. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her knitting needles and observed the familiar tableau with quiet satisfaction. The vicar's wife presided over the cake stall with military precision, while Colonel Bantry expounded upon his prize roses to anyone within earshot. It was precisely the sort of peaceful gathering that made their village the envy of neighboring parishes, where nothing more scandalous than Mrs. Dolly Bantry's choice of hat typically warranted discussion over afternoon tea. The Georgian manor house provided an elegant backdrop, its honey-colored stone walls warming in the September light. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the recently widowed mistress of Greenway House, moved gracefully among her guests with practiced ease. At 58, she possessed that understated elegance that spoke of good breeding rather than natural beauty. Her black mourning dress was perfectly cut, and she wore her grief like a well-fitted glove. Present, but not overwhelming. Miss Marple had known Cordelia since childhood, though they had never been intimate friends. The Ashworth family maintained a certain distance from village life, charitable but reserved. James Ashworth's sudden death from a heart attack 4 months prior had shocked everyone, particularly because he had seemed so robust for a man of 70. Such a lovely turnout, Cordelia was saying to the group gathered around the refreshment table. James would have been so pleased. He always said the garden fete was his favorite day of the year. Her voice carried the right note of wistful remembrance, though Miss Marple detected something else beneath it. Perhaps relief, though that might have been imagination. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. A good man, James. We all miss him. He glanced meaningfully at his younger companion. Dr. Pemberton here has been invaluable since James's passing. Cordelia, you remember I mentioned Dr. Pemberton would be joining the practice? Miss Marple watched the introduction with interest. Dr. Richard Pemberton was perhaps 45, with lean, ascetic features that suggested either great thoughtfulness or chronic worry. When he took Cordelia's hand, Miss Marple noticed how his fingers lingered longer than strictly necessary, and how Cordelia's cheeks acquired a faint flush. Dr. Pemberton has been such a comfort, Cordelia murmured. So attentive to my health since James's death. I'm afraid I've been rather a trial with my silly fainting spells and headaches. Not silly at all, Dr. Pemberton replied warmly. Grief manifests in many ways. You must allow yourself time to heal. Young Timothy Ashworth, James's nephew and presumptive heir, seemed less pleased by this attention. At 35, Timothy possessed the soft appearance of a man who had never worked particularly hard for anything. His fair hair was thinning, his waistcoat strained slightly, but his clothes were expensive. Aunt Cordelia has always been delicate, he said with subtle edge. Uncle James worried constantly about her constitution. The conversation was interrupted by Miss Lavinia Blacklock, practically vibrating with excitement. Oh, my dears, you'll never guess what I've heard. Mrs. Hartnell was arranging flowers this morning and overheard the most extraordinary thing. Cordelia, dear, she distinctly heard you having quite an animated conversation in the drawing-room, but you appeared to be entirely alone. She heard you addressing someone as James and saying something about not letting them get away with it. Most peculiar, don't you think? The effect was immediate and electric. Dr. Pemberton stepped closer to Cordelia, his face creased with concern. Timothy's expression darkened considerably, while other guests leaned in hungrily. I was not talking to a portrait, Cordelia said firmly, though her voice trembled. I was simply remembering. Sometimes when one is alone, one speaks one's thoughts aloud. Surely that's not unusual. Miss Marple noticed how Cordelia's hands shook, how she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. More intriguingly, she observed Timothy's reaction, not surprise or concern, but something remarkably like fear. The awkward moment was broken by commotion from the house. Mrs. Hartnell appeared, face flushed, usually immaculate hair disheveled. Mrs. Ashworth, something dreadful has happened." They hurried toward the house, following Mrs. Hartnell through French doors into the drawing room. The room was elegant in traditional English manner, with Persian rugs, heavy oak furniture, and walls lined with family portraits. But the largest portrait, hanging above the fireplace, drew everyone's attention. The painting depicted James Ashworth in his prime, standing beside a magnificent bay horse. It was competent work, capturing both dignity and essential kindness. But now the canvas bore shocking disfigurement. A long, jagged slash ran from James's painted throat to his chest, as though someone had attacked the image with a knife. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Miss Marple watched faces carefully, noting reactions. Cordelia had gone pale and swayed slightly. Dr. Pemberton immediately supported her, his arm encircling her waist with practiced familiarity. Timothy stared at the damaged portrait with an expression that might have been satisfaction, quickly schooled into appropriate shock. "Who could have done such a thing?" Dr. Haydock demanded. Miss Marple said nothing, but her sharp eyes took in every detail. The knife was nowhere visible. The slash was clean and deliberate, not random damage, but something purposeful and symbolic. Most interesting was that while everyone stared at the ruined portrait, Cordelia's gaze kept drifting to the window overlooking the gardens, as though expecting to see someone watching. The peaceful afternoon had shattered as effectively as thrown glass, and Miss Marple suspected this was only the beginning. The silence that followed Mrs. Hartnell's announcement stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sounds of the fete continuing on the lawn outside. Miss Marple observed how each person in the room processed the shock differently. Cordelia's hands trembling against her black silk gloves. Timothy's quick glance toward the French doors as if calculating escape routes. Dr. Pemberton's immediate movement to shield Cordelia from the other's stares. Within 20 minutes, Constable Polk arrived, his bicycle propped hastily against the garden wall. A methodical man who had served St. Mary Mead for 15 years without encountering anything more serious than poaching disputes. He stood before the damaged portrait with visible bewilderment, notebook clutched in weathered hands. "Now then," he began uncertainly, "this would be what we call malicious damage to property. Mrs. Ashworth, have you any idea who might have done such a thing?" Cordelia remained pale, still leaning slightly against Dr. Pemberton's reassuring presence. "I cannot imagine, Constable. James was universally respected. I've never known anyone to harbor ill feeling toward him." Miss Marple noticed how Cordelia's gaze kept drifting to the mantelpiece, where a faint outline in the dust suggested something had recently been removed. She also observed that Timothy's concern seemed performative rather than genuine, his questions designed to direct attention away from family members. "The question is access," Timothy said, his voice carrying an odd note of authority. "Who had opportunity to enter the house during the fete? Surely someone would have noticed an intruder." Mrs. Hartnell, having delivered the initial shock, now wrung her hands with obvious relish. "Constable, I must tell you what I overheard this morning. I was arranging flowers in the church, and the drawing-room window was open. I distinctly heard Mrs. Ashworth's voice, quite agitated, saying something like, 'James, you cannot let them get away with this deception.' Then she said, 'The truth must come out, and I won't let your memory be dishonored.' The effect was immediate. Colonel Bantry drew himself up to his full, bristling height. "Good God, Cordelia, you were speaking to the portrait?" "I was not talking to a portrait," Cordelia said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I was simply remembering. Sometimes when one is alone, one speaks one's thoughts aloud." Miss Marple watched the subtle interplay of expressions. Timothy's reaction was not surprise, but something remarkably like fear. Dr. Pemberton's protective gesture seemed to exclude the rest of the room entirely. As Constable Polk examined the portrait more closely, Miss Marple conducted her own quiet investigation. A footstool was not quite where the sun's faded rectangle on the carpet suggested it ought to be. The curtains bulged slightly, as though recently handled. Most tellingly, a narrow crescent on the polished mantelpiece was free of dust, a space where some object had stood until very recently. There was a bronze paperweight here, Cordelia admitted when pressed. James brought it home from Cairo in 1923. I cannot think where it might be. Mrs. Hartnell's head came up sharply. That bronze thingummy was there at breakfast, ma'am. As I live and breathe, it was there when I did my polishing. Dr. Haydock, peering at the writing desk, made another discovery. Letter opener set, Mrs. Ashworth. I see 3 slots, but only 2 filled. The brass one with the lion, Mrs. Hartnell supplied helpfully. Mr. Ashworth used to waggle it when he was thinking. Not there now. The theories began almost immediately, each reflecting the speaker's particular biases. Miss Blacklock suggested family discord over the inheritance. Colonel Bantry suspected business rivals. Dr. Haydock, with clinical detachment, wondered aloud about grief manifesting in destructive ways. Grief can manifest in strange ways, he said, glancing at Cordelia with professional sympathy. Unconscious acts can sometimes be quite revealing. Miss Marple noted how Cordelia flinched, not just from the implied accusation, but from the very public discussion of her emotional state. More interesting was Timothy's visible discomfort, not at the suggestion of vandalism, but at the general air of scrutiny. It's a warning, that's what it is, declared Mrs. Hartnell to her growing audience. A message from beyond the grave, perhaps. Or maybe, she lowered her voice conspiratorially. Maybe it was her doing, in a moment of grief-stricken delusion. Through it all, Miss Marple remained an island of quiet observation. She watched Cordelia's eyes repeatedly stray to the window, her hand unconsciously smoothing her black dress. She saw the possessive way Dr. Pemberton held Cordelia, a gesture that went beyond mere professional solicitude. She noticed a thin, dark thread clinging to the portrait's frame, coarser than silk, not glossy enough to be hair. Most significantly, while the others debated theories, she managed to collect several small fragments of torn paper from the Persian rug beneath the portrait. The pieces appeared to be portions of a letter written in feminine handwriting. She could make out only partial words, must tell the truth, and cannot continue this charade. As the afternoon wore on and the fate finally dispersed, Constable Polk concluded his preliminary investigation with obvious relief. I'll be making inquiries throughout the village tomorrow, Mrs. Ashworth. Someone must have seen something suspicious. The gathering began to break up, but Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly organizing her knitting. She observed the final interactions with particular interest, Cordelia accepting Dr. Pemberton's offer to remain for the evening, Timothy's obvious displeasure at this arrangement, the way conversations dropped to whispers when certain people drew near. Walking home through the village in the gathering twilight, Miss Marple examined the paper fragments more carefully. The handwriting was educated, feminine, and the partial phrases suggested secrets and deception. The afternoon's events had revealed far more than simple vandalism. Someone in that drawing room was harboring dangerous secrets, and the slashed portrait was not random violence, but a deliberate message. The peaceful village had unwittingly stepped onto the stage of a darker drama, and Miss Marple suspected this was merely the opening act. The morning after the garden fete arrived, with that peculiar quality of aftermath that settles over a village when scandal has disturbed its carefully maintained equilibrium. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and took her position in the front garden with her secateurs and a strategic view of the main thoroughfare. The morning ritual of village life provided excellent opportunities for observation, and she had learned long ago that people revealed their truest natures when they believed themselves unobserved. The paper fragments from the previous evening lay pressed beneath her atlas, their partial words haunting her thoughts. Under careful examination with her magnifying glass, she had managed to piece together additional phrases. James suspected, and what appeared to be the truth about. The handwriting was undoubtedly feminine, educated, with a distinctive flourish on the letter H that suggested someone accustomed to quality stationery and formal correspondence. Mrs. Hartnell appeared first, her usual brisk morning walk notably slowed by the weight of yesterday's revelations. She paused at Miss Marple's gate with obvious intent, her expression bearing that particular combination of concern and excitement that accompanied truly significant gossip. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple. I've barely slept a wink thinking about poor dear Mrs. Ashworth. Dr. Pemberton stayed the night, you know, purely professional, of course, though people will naturally talk. And Timothy Ashworth left quite early this morning with a suitcase. Most peculiar behavior for a nephew concerned about his aunt's welfare." Miss Marple continued her methodical pruning, noting how Mrs. Hartnell's information confirmed her growing suspicions about family dynamics. Timothy's hasty departure suggested either guilt or fear, quite possibly both. "How thoughtful of Dr. Pemberton to remain," she observed mildly. "Though I imagine Mrs. Ashworth has many friends willing to provide support during such a difficult time." The morning's reconnaissance yielded several interesting observations. At the post office, she witnessed Timothy Ashworth dispatching what appeared to be an urgent telegram, his usual languid demeanor replaced by nervous energy. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote the message, and he glanced repeatedly over his shoulder as though expecting unwelcome attention. Dr. Haydock, making his morning rounds, provided another piece of the puzzle when Miss Marple intercepted him with practiced casualness near the church gate. "Doctor, I do hope Mrs. Ashworth is feeling better this morning. Such a shock yesterday." His professional discretion warred visibly with genuine concern. "I cannot discuss specific patients, Miss Marple, but I will say that grief can manifest in unexpected ways. When someone begins experiencing conversations with deceased loved ones, it often indicates severe psychological distress." The clinical assessment was interesting, though Miss Marple suspected it might be too convenient an explanation. She had observed genuine grief many times, and Cordelia's behavior suggested something more complex than simple bereavement. Her most significant discovery came through young Joe Peel, the gardener at Greenway House, whom she encountered while admiring the rowan berries along the boundary wall. His respectful manner encouraged confidence, and he volunteered information with the natural openness of someone who worked with his hands rather than his tongue. "Found something odd this morning, Miss Marple," he said, producing a coarse thread of dark wool from his pocket. "Caught on the lower hinge of the drawing-room casement. Too fine for working clothes, but not quite gentleman suiting either." She examined the thread carefully. It was indeed unusual, darker than navy, with a slight sheen that suggested quality material. The length indicated a snag rather than deliberate placement, and its position suggested someone had passed very close to the window, perhaps even climbed through it. "And there's this," Joe continued, leading her toward the yew hedge. "Found the missing bronze paperweight behind here, not 10 steps from the drawing-room window. Mud on the base, but the top was clean as a whistle. Whoever carried it held it careful-like." This discovery transformed her understanding of the previous day's events. The paperweight hadn't been thrown in panic but deliberately concealed, then hastily retrieved when its hiding place no longer felt secure. Someone had planned carefully, then been forced to improvise. By noon, the village buzzed with competing theories. At the general store, Miss Blacklock held court with her own assessment. "It's all about the will, I'm certain. James Ashworth was a wealthy man, and there are always complications with inheritance. Perhaps someone felt cheated." This sparked animated discussion about Ashworth family finances, always a topic of fascination in a village where inherited wealth was rare and much discussed. It was known that James had made recent changes to his testamentary arrangements, though the specifics remained tantalizingly unclear. Constable Polk's methodical investigation proceeded with characteristic thoroughness but limited imagination. He was searching for obvious culprits, disgruntled employees, mischievous youth, perhaps a burglar interrupted in his work. The possibility of deeper, more insidious motives seemed beyond his consideration. Miss Marple noted the villagers' distinctly different reactions to James Ashworth's death versus the portrait's destruction. His passing had been met with polite sadness. The vandalism, however, had ignited passionate, almost gleeful curiosity. It was as though the crime had granted permission to explore unspoken tensions that lay beneath the village's placid surface. The afternoon brought Dr. Pemberton's departure from Greenway House, his usual composed demeanor notably strained. He stopped at the post office to dispatch his own urgent telegram, and Miss Marple observed his careful, almost furtive manner as he wrote the message. As evening approached, she assembled the day's observations into a clearer picture. The physical evidence, the thread, the paperweight's location, the missing letter opener, suggested careful planning followed by hasty improvisation. The human evidence, Timothy's flight, Dr. Pemberton's telegrams, Cordelia's isolation, pointed to secrets that went far deeper than simple vandalism. The paper fragments remained her most intriguing clue. Someone had written about truth and deception, about James's suspicions. Whether Cordelia was the author or the target of these words remained unclear, but Miss Marple suspected the answer would prove crucial to understanding why someone had felt compelled to slash James Ashworth's painted image with such violent precision. The peaceful village had indeed become a stage for darker drama, and the opening scenes were revealing a cast of characters with far more complex motivations than their public faces suggested. The second morning brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, his arrival announced by the authoritative rumble of a police motor car that sent village curtains twitching along the high street. Miss Marple observed his brisk emergence from behind her sitting-room window, noting the confident set of his shoulders and the way he immediately took charge of Constable Polk with a few sharp words. Inspector Slack possessed that particular urban certainty that often served him well in straightforward cases, but could blind him to the subtle currents that required patient observation rather than aggressive interrogation. Within an hour of his arrival, the inspector had established his headquarters in Greenway House's morning room and begun his systematic interviews. Miss Marple, arriving with a modest bouquet of late roses from her garden, positioned herself in the drawing-room where she could observe the proceedings while ostensibly arranging flowers. Through the partially open door, she watched Inspector Slack's technique with professional interest. "Now then, Mrs. Ashworth," his voice carried clearly, "you maintain that you have no idea who might have damaged your late husband's portrait. Yet we have a missing letter opener, a bronze paperweight found hidden in your garden, and witnesses who heard you, having agitated conversations with no one present. Someone had feelings strong enough to risk discovery during a public gathering." Cordelia's response was barely audible, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in her voice. "James was universally respected, Inspector. If anyone harbored ill feelings toward him, they concealed it remarkably well. As for the paperweight, I certainly did not place it behind the hedge." Inspector Slack's pen scratched across his notebook with decisive strokes. "Your nephew departed rather hastily yesterday morning with a suitcase and sent an urgent telegram. To whom was this message addressed?" The pause that followed was infinitesimal but telling. "His solicitor, I assume. Timothy worries about practical matters, particularly regarding the estate." Miss Marple noted how Cordelia's hands tightened in her lap during this exchange and how her gaze kept drifting toward the damaged portrait as though it might provide answers she couldn't voice herself. The household staff followed in orderly succession. Mrs. Hartnell stood rigid with importance, delivering her testimony about the overheard conversation with theatrical precision. Young Elsie, the housemaid, seemed terrified of saying anything that might displease her mistress, while Joe Peel repeated his account of the discovered evidence with honest directness. "The thread was caught low on the casement," Joe explained, producing the dark wool fiber from his pocket. That window sticks something fierce unless you know to lift and push just so. Not the sort of thing a stranger would chance upon, if you take my meaning." Inspector Slack's expression brightened considerably. "Excellent observation, Peel. That does narrow our field considerably." Miss Marple filed this information alongside her own observations about the portrait's frame. During a quiet moment, she had noticed faint traces of old sealing wax along the stretcher's edge and a thin crescent of clean wood where dust had been recently disturbed. Most intriguingly, a tiny fragment of cream paper clung to a rusted tack near the lower corner, bearing the partial watermark of what appeared to be quality stationery. Dr. Pemberton arrived for his interview looking grave and professional, though Miss Marple observed a small snag in the lower hem of his tweed coat, where threads had puckered. Not unusual for a country doctor, but the thread Joe had found possessed a similar subtle sheen. "I remained with Mrs. Ashworth last night because I deemed it medically prudent," he stated with careful precision. "She had suffered a considerable shock. Grief can manifest in unexpected ways, Inspector, including what might appear to be conversations with deceased loved ones." "You sent a telegram this morning as well," Inspector Slack noted, "to a colleague in London regarding a patient consultation. Entirely confidential, I'm afraid." Miss Marple watched the interplay of expressions during this exchange. Dr. Pemberton's protective stance toward Cordelia went beyond mere professional concern, while Cordelia herself seemed caught between gratitude and something that might have been apprehension. As the afternoon progressed, Inspector Slack's theory crystallized around the obvious suspect. Timothy Ashworth's hasty departure, combined with his position as primary heir and his known financial dependence on his uncle, created a compelling narrative of family discord and impulsive vandalism. "Clear case of inheritance dispute," the inspector confided to Constable Polk within Miss Marple's hearing. "Young man probably expected more immediate access to funds. Took out his frustration on the old gentleman's portrait. We'll have him back here for questioning within the day." But Miss Marple found herself troubled by the inspector's confidence. The physical evidence suggested careful planning rather than impulsive destruction, and the missing items, particularly the letter opener, remained unaccounted for. Most significantly, the paper fragments she had collected told a story of deliberate deception rather than spontaneous emotional outburst. Her unease deepened when she encountered Miss Molly French at the village library that afternoon. The meticulous librarian mentioned, almost casually, that Dr. Pemberton had visited the previous day seeking books on medicinal plants and their properties. "Rather unusual request for a general practitioner," Miss French observed. "He seemed particularly interested in substances that might affect the heart, claiming it was for a difficult patient case." This information cast James Ashworth's sudden death in a new light. While Dr. Haydock had attributed the heart attack to natural causes, the timing seemed remarkably convenient for certain parties. Miss Marple recalled Cordelia's mention of her husband's recent troubled sleep and his speaking of names she didn't recognize. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared his preliminary report, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The inspector's straightforward approach had uncovered useful information, but his eagerness to blame Timothy overlooked crucial inconsistencies. The dark thread, the hidden paperweight, the missing documents suggested by the sealing wax residue, these elements pointed to a more complex conspiracy than simple family discord. Most troubling was her growing certainty that James Ashworth had discovered something significant before his death. Something that threatened someone enough to risk murder disguised as natural causes. The portrait's destruction wasn't random vandalism but a deliberate message, and Timothy's flight might represent fear rather than guilt. The village could sleep peacefully, satisfied that Inspector Slack had the matter well in hand. But Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood exactly how to exploit official assumptions, using society's preference for simple explanations to conceal far more sinister truths. Someone in St. Mary Mead was playing a very sophisticated game indeed, and the slashed portrait was merely the opening gambit. The third morning brought with it that peculiar quality of suspension that follows official pronouncements when a village collectively holds its breath while waiting to see whether accepted truths will hold firm or crumble under closer scrutiny. Miss Marple had spent the early hours re-examining her collected evidence under stronger light, and the additional details she uncovered sent a chill of certainty through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through her cottage windows. The paper fragments, when arranged more systematically, revealed a partial watermark bearing what appeared to be intertwined initials, possibly J.A. for James Ashworth, though the fragment was tantalizingly incomplete. More significantly, the quality of the cream paper suggested personal correspondence rather than casual notes, and the phrases "cannot continue this charade" and "James suspected" took on increasingly ominous implications when considered alongside the missing portfolio that Cordelia had mentioned during yesterday's brief conversation. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Lavinia Blacklock, whose natural inclination for collecting and disseminating information often proved more valuable than official investigations. Miss Blacklock settled herself in the morning room with the air of someone bearing significant intelligence. "Such dreadful business with poor Timothy," she began, though her eyes sparkled with the unmistakable excitement of someone privy to scandalous developments. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, there are aspects of this affair that puzzle me considerably. Mrs. Price, who does the heavy cleaning at Greenway House, mentioned something rather interesting about Mr. Ashworth's final weeks." Miss Marple encouraged this confidence with appropriate murmurs while continuing her seemingly innocent needlework, a technique that had served her well in extracting information from voluble neighbors. According to Mrs. Price, Mr. Ashworth had what she described as a blazing row with someone just 3 weeks before his death. She heard raised voices from the study, most unusual for such a reserved gentleman, with Mr. Ashworth shouting about disloyalty and breach of trust. Mrs. Price assumed it concerned business matters, but the visitor left through the garden rather than the front door, which struck her as odd. This detail resonated powerfully with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the case. James Ashworth was known for his measured temperament and old-fashioned courtesies. For him to engage in heated argument suggested provocation of the most serious nature, while the visitor's surreptitious departure implied someone with reason to avoid public association with the household. Her morning reconnaissance continued with a carefully casual encounter with Mrs. Dawley, Bantry near the post office, where that usually observant lady provided another piece of the puzzle without realizing its significance. "Poor Cordelia seems to be adjusting remarkably well," Mrs. Bantry observed, with the sort of innocent commentary that often revealed more than intended. "I remember how devastated she was when James first took ill last spring, quite beside herself with worry. Now, though she maintains proper mourning, there's something different about her. Less anxious, perhaps. Almost as though a burden has been lifted. Less burdened." The phrase struck Miss Marple as particularly telling. Grief, in her extensive experience, rarely manifested as relief so soon after loss, unless the deceased had represented some form of ongoing strain or anxiety. Combined with Dr. Pemberton's notably protective behavior and his extended presence at Greenway House, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Determining to examine the physical evidence more thoroughly, Miss Marple arranged an afternoon visit to Greenway House under the pretext of offering practical assistance with household arrangements. She found Cordelia in the drawing room, ostensibly reading but clearly distracted, her gaze repeatedly drawn to the damaged portrait as though it might provide answers to unspoken questions. "Such a shock for everyone," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, while her sharp eyes conducted a methodical survey of the room. Inspector Slack seems confident in his assessment, though one always wonders about the smaller details that might escape official notice. As she spoke, Miss Marple's attention was caught by an almost imperceptible glimmer near the edge of the Persian rug's dark floral pattern. Stooping to adjust her knitting bag, she managed to scrape her fingernail across the spot, collecting a microscopic speck of metallic residue. Under closer examination, the substance proved to be brass filings, exactly what one might expect from the missing letter opener, if it had been used for purposes requiring considerable force. The location of this evidence was particularly significant. The brass dust lay not where an item might naturally fall or be dropped, but in a position suggesting deliberate use followed by careful cleaning. Someone had employed the letter opener as a tool in this very spot, then attempted to remove all traces of the activity. This discovery, combined with the sealing wax residue she had observed on the portrait's frame, painted a clear picture of systematic search and extraction. James Ashworth had concealed something behind his portrait, quite possibly the missing portfolio Cordelia had mentioned, and someone had used the letter opener to retrieve it, slashing the canvas afterward either in frustration or as deliberate misdirection. During her visit, Miss Marple also noted subtle changes in the household's atmosphere. Mrs. Hartnell moved about her duties with grim efficiency, but her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something approaching apprehension. Young Elsie seemed particularly nervous, starting at unexpected sounds and avoiding direct eye contact when questioned about recent events. Most telling was Cordelia's behavior when Dr. Pemberton arrived for his evening visit. The widow's entire demeanor transformed, her posture straightened, color returned to her cheeks, and she displayed an animation notably absent during other conversations. The doctor's manner, while maintaining professional propriety, suggested an intimacy that extended beyond mere medical consultation. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she managed a brief conversation with Joe Peel, whose honest nature and keen observational skills often provided valuable insights overlooked by more sophisticated witnesses. "Been thinking about that thread I found, Miss Marple," he confided quietly. "The more I consider it, the more I'm certain it came from quality cloth. Not working clothes, but not quite gentleman's suiting either. More like what a professional man might wear for country visits." Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's accumulated evidence. The brass dust, the mysterious heated argument, Cordelia's transformed demeanor, and the pattern of Dr. Pemberton's increasingly frequent visits all pointed toward a conspiracy far more sophisticated than Timothy's alleged vandalism. Someone had murdered James Ashworth and was now systematically eliminating evidence of their crime, using the portrait's destruction as both practical necessity and elaborate misdirection. The village slept peacefully, confident in Inspector Slack's straightforward solution, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood exactly how to exploit official assumptions and social conventions to conceal their true nature. The fourth morning arrived with that deceptive tranquility that often precedes significant revelations, when the accumulated weight of small observations finally begins to form a coherent pattern. Miss Marple had spent the early hours reviewing her collected evidence under the strengthening autumn light, and the implications that emerged sent a distinct chill through her that had nothing to do with the season's advancing cold. Her contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Hartnell's arrival at the garden gate, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. The housekeeper glanced repeatedly over her shoulder before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper despite the early hour's privacy. "Miss Marple, I must speak with someone sensible about what I discovered while cleaning the study fireplace this morning. The chimney's been smoking dreadfully, and when I cleared the grate, I found the most disturbing things among the ashes." She produced a small envelope containing several charred paper fragments, her hands trembling as she passed them over the gate. "They're partially burned, but not completely destroyed. The writing appears to be in Mr. Ashworth's hand, and I could make out portions of what seemed to be serious accusations. There were phrases about professional misconduct and systematic deception, and one fragment that mentioned something about evidence must be preserved. Miss Marple examined the burned remnants with careful attention, noting the quality of the paper and the distinctive handwriting that matched other Ashworth documents she had observed. The implications were deeply troubling. James Ashworth had not only suspected wrongdoing but had been documenting evidence of it, quite possibly building a case against someone he had trusted. Mrs. Hartnell, in the weeks before Mr. Ashworth's death, did you notice any changes in his routine or behavior? Any unusual visitors or correspondence? The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful. Now that you mention it, he had been spending considerable time in his study, often working late into the evening. Dr. Pemberton's visits had become much more frequent, and Mr. Ashworth seemed increasingly troubled after each consultation. There was also that heated argument I mentioned, the visitor who left through the garden rather than the front door. This information, combined with her previous observations, began to paint a disturbing picture. Miss Marple recalled Dr. Pemberton's notably protective behavior toward Cordelia, his frequent presence at Greenway House, and his curious interest in medicinal plants affecting the heart. Determining to gather additional information, Miss Marple arranged an afternoon visit with Mr. Arthur Humphrey, the retired solicitor who had handled the Ashworth family's legal affairs for decades. His sharp memory and discretionary nature made him an invaluable source of information about James's final weeks. A troubling business indeed, Miss Marple, Mr. Humphrey confided over tea in his book-lined study. James had become quite preoccupied in recent weeks. He visited me several times, speaking of concerns about a substantial investment that he believed was being misappropriated. He was gathering documentation, he said, building a case against what he termed an unscrupulous individual who had gained his trust. The elderly solicitor paused, stroking his chin thoughtfully. He also seemed troubled by something more personal. He spoke of a long-standing arrangement, a gentleman's agreement that he felt had been violated. He mentioned keeping important documents in a very secure location, somewhere no one would think to look. He was planning to confront this individual within days of his death. A secure location where no one would think to look. Miss Marple immediately thought of the faint traces of sealing wax behind James's portrait, the clean patch of wood where something had been recently removed. The missing portfolio, the documents James had been compiling, had been hidden there. Someone had known about this hiding place and had needed to retrieve those papers urgently. The brass filings she had discovered, the missing letter opener, the thread caught on the window casement, all pointed to someone who had used the garden fete as cover for entering the house and extracting the hidden evidence. The portrait's destruction wasn't random vandalism, but a desperate attempt to conceal the true purpose of the break-in. Walking home through the village in the late afternoon light, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging. James Ashworth had discovered some form of systematic deception, quite possibly involving financial fraud and personal betrayal. His investigation had threatened someone close enough to know about his hiding places and methods. The timing of his death, so conveniently preventing his planned confrontation, suggested something far more sinister than natural causes. Dr. Pemberton's behavior took on new significance in this context. His frequent visits, his protective stance toward Cordelia, his medical knowledge, and his access to substances that could affect the heart all warranted closer examination. The widow's remarkably rapid adjustment to her loss, her apparent relief rather than grief, suggested either complicity or manipulation of the most calculated nature. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple prepared for the delicate task of gathering additional evidence without alerting the perpetrators to her suspicions. The village's most dangerous criminal was someone who understood exactly how to exploit professional respectability and social conventions to conceal their true nature. The slashed portrait had been both practical necessity and theatrical misdirection, designed to focus attention on family disputes while concealing a far more sophisticated conspiracy. The peaceful village slept on, unaware that beneath its tranquil surface, a web of deception was slowly being unraveled by someone who understood that the most revealing truths often lay hidden in the smallest details of human behavior. The fifth morning arrived with that deceptive calm that often precedes the most significant revelations, when accumulated evidence finally coheres into patterns that demand immediate action. Miss Marple had spent the early hours reviewing her collected fragments and observations, and the implications that emerged sent a distinct chill through her that had nothing to do with autumn's advancing cold. Her contemplation was interrupted by the authoritative rumble of Inspector Slack's motor car, followed shortly by the sight of Timothy Ashworth being escorted up the drive to Greenway House, with the resigned air of a man who had expected this moment but hoped it might be delayed indefinitely. Within the hour, the drawing room had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with Inspector Slack presiding over what he clearly believed would be the case's resolution. Timothy sat rigidly in the uncomfortable gilt chair his uncle had always despised, his usual languid manner replaced by obvious apprehension. Cordelia maintained her composed bearing, though Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she thought herself unobserved. "Now then, Mr. Ashworth," Inspector Slack began with obvious satisfaction, "we've had time to consider your hasty departure and that urgent telegram of yours. Perhaps you'd care to explain your whereabouts during yesterday afternoon's festivities, particularly between 3 and 4:30 when the portrait was damaged." Timothy's response carried the petulant tone of a man accustomed to having his explanations accepted without question. "I was walking in the village, Inspector. I needed to clear my head after some rather unpleasant discussions about my future prospects. Uncle James had become increasingly unreasonable about financial matters, threatening to reduce my allowance substantially. I admit I was angry enough to wish him considerable inconvenience, but I certainly didn't vandalize his portrait." The inspector's pen scratched across his notebook with decisive strokes, clearly viewing Timothy's admission of anger as confirmation of his theory. But Miss Marple observed the young man's manner with growing certainty that his frustration, while genuine, lacked the calculating intelligence required for the systematic deception she had witnessed. Timothy possessed the temperament for impulsive outbursts, not carefully orchestrated conspiracies. The morning's proceedings took an unexpected turn when Inspector Slack produced a brown envelope with theatrical flourish. "We received this at the station this morning, Mr. Ashworth. An anonymous posting containing some rather interesting items." He withdrew a brass letter opener, its lion handle dulled by fingerprints, followed by a folded sheet of cream paper. "The opener appears to be the one missing from your aunt's desk, and this confession, signed in your hand, admits to destroying the portrait in a fit of temper." Timothy's reaction was immediate and unguarded. "That's preposterous. I never wrote any such thing, and I've never seen that letter opener before in my life." His eyes darted to the brass implement with an expression that suggested not guilt, but alarmed recognition of the trap it represented. Miss Marple examined the confession with careful attention when the inspector permitted her a glance. The handwriting, while attempting to mimic masculine characteristics, displayed subtle feminine flourishes, particularly in the formation of the letter RH, that matched the paper fragments she had discovered. Someone had taken considerable care to create convincing evidence against Timothy, but their deception revealed more about the forger than the supposed culprit. The morning's revelations were interrupted by Mrs. Hartnell's arrival, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious excitement. "Inspector, I must show you something I discovered while cleaning Mr. Ashworth's study. I found this tucked inside the lining of his old desk. Blotter nearly threw it away, thinking it was just old paper." She produced a yellowed envelope, its seal broken, addressed in James Ashworth's distinctive handwriting. Cordelia accepted it with visible reluctance, her face growing pale as she read the contents. When she looked up, her gaze sought Miss Marple's with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding. "It's a letter from James," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "dated just 1 week before his death. He writes of his intention to revise his will completely, to disinherit me entirely due to what he terms my systematic deception and betrayal of our marriage vows." The effect was immediate and electric. Timothy stared in genuine shock, his own grievances suddenly insignificant. Dr. Pemberton, who had maintained protective silence throughout the proceedings, went rigid with what might have been fear or calculation. "He discovered something," Cordelia continued, her voice gaining strength through obvious effort. "He mentions a gentleman's agreement that I had violated and speaks of evidence he had compiled. He intended to confront me with his accusations within days of his death." Miss Marple watched the subtle interplay of expressions with professional interest. The letter's convenient discovery, following so closely upon the forged confession, suggested a pattern of evidence being produced at precisely the moments when it would have maximum impact. Someone was orchestrating these revelations with remarkable sophistication, using each dramatic moment to redirect suspicion while concealing their own involvement. The inspector's carefully constructed case against Timothy crumbled instantly, replaced by far more compelling motives involving inheritance, adultery, and systematic fraud. But Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that both the confession and the letter represented elaborate misdirection by someone who understood exactly how to exploit official assumptions and create convincing narratives. As the morning progressed and theories multiplied around her, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated nature of the deception she was witnessing. The true criminal possessed not only detailed knowledge of the household and its secrets, but also the psychological insight to manipulate both evidence and emotions with remarkable precision. The peaceful village had become the stage for a performance of extraordinary subtlety, where each revelation served to conceal rather than illuminate the truth. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned through long experience, were often those who understood that the most effective deceptions were built upon foundations of partial truth, using society's willingness to accept dramatic explanations to mask far more complex realities. The afternoon following the dramatic discovery of James Ashworth's letter settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar quality of suspended animation that follows significant revelations, when a community collectively holds its breath while official authority reorganizes itself around new possibilities. Inspector Slack had departed for Much Benham to consult with his superiors about the case's unexpected complications, leaving behind a household where every glance carried weight and every conversation seemed to conceal more than it revealed. Miss Marple had observed the morning's proceedings with growing certainty that the most sophisticated deceptions were yet to be fully exposed. The convenient timing of each revelation, Timothy's forged confession, James's incriminating letter, the missing documents, suggested an orchestration of remarkable psychological insight. Someone was not merely reacting to events, but actively shaping them, using each dramatic moment to redirect suspicion while concealing their own involvement. Her opportunity for deeper investigation came when she encountered Dr. Pemberton near the village green, his usual composed demeanor notably strained as he emerged from the post office with what appeared to be another urgent telegram. His medical bag seemed unusually heavy, and she noticed how he glanced repeatedly over his shoulder as though expecting unwelcome attention. "Such a distressing business for everyone," she observed with gentle sympathy, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his coat. Mrs. Ashworth must be finding these revelations particularly difficult to bear. His response revealed more than he perhaps intended. "Cordelia has always been more resilient than people assume, Miss Marple. She's endured considerable strain over the years, though she's maintained admirable discretion about her difficulties. James could be quite demanding in his expectations, particularly regarding matters of personal conduct." The carefully chosen words suggested intimate knowledge of the Ashworth marriage's private dynamics, while his protective tone indicated involvement that extended far beyond professional medical consultation. Miss Marple noted the faint scent that clung to his clothing, wintergreen and carbolic, the distinctive combination she had detected in her cottage after yesterday's mysterious visitor. Her next encounter proved even more illuminating. Mrs. Price, the cleaning woman who had mentioned James Ashworth's final heated argument, approached her near the churchyard with obvious agitation, glancing around nervously before speaking in hushed tones. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about that terrible row I overheard, and I remembered something important. The visitor who left through the garden. I caught a glimpse of him from the upstairs window. It was Dr. Pemberton, I'm certain of it. He was carrying what looked like a medical case, but also a large envelope or portfolio of some kind." This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case's timeline. Dr. Pemberton had not only been present during James's final confrontation, but had departed with what might well have been the missing documents. The heated argument Mrs. Price had described could have been James confronting the doctor with evidence of wrongdoing, quite possibly involving both professional misconduct and personal betrayal. Determined to test her growing suspicions, Miss Marple arranged an afternoon visit to Greenway House under the pretext of offering practical assistance with household arrangements. She found Cordelia in the drawing room, ostensibly reading but clearly distracted, her gaze repeatedly drawn to the damaged portrait as though it might provide answers to unspoken questions. During their conversation, Miss Marple noticed several telling details. A prescription bottle on the side table bore Dr. Pemberton's name but was labeled for a medication typically used to treat heart conditions. Curious for a woman who had never mentioned cardiac problems. More significantly, a partially visible letter on the writing desk displayed the same distinctive handwriting as the forged confession attributed to Timothy, with particular attention to the characteristic flourish on the letter H. As they spoke, Dr. Pemberton arrived for what had apparently become his regular evening visit. Miss Marple observed the subtle transformation in Cordelia's demeanor, the way her posture straightened. Color returned to her cheeks, and her previous anxiety was replaced by something approaching anticipation. The doctor's manner, while maintaining professional propriety, suggested an intimacy that extended far beyond medical consultation. Choosing a moment when the conversation lulled, Miss Marple spoke with gentle, almost conversational tone, yet her words carried the weight of decades of human observation. "It is such a pity that Mr. Ashworth found himself so troubled in his final weeks. One hears of such things in the village, you know, when a person becomes convinced of a great wrong, a deep injustice. They say it can consume a person, quite literally. Sometimes, when the mind is so burdened, the heart simply gives out." Her seemingly innocent remark hung in the air, freighted with double meaning that only certain listeners could fully grasp. She watched Dr. Pemberton carefully. His composure, usually unshakable, fractured for a fleeting moment. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a flash of something cold and calculating replacing his professional calm. He quickly regained control, but the momentary lapse was enough. Cordelia, too, reacted with a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, her eyes widening as if in sudden, terrified understanding of Miss Marple's veiled implication. The fear in her expression was not merely for herself and the accusations in James's letter, but for the man standing beside her, a fear born of shared guilt or terrible complicity. Walking home through the village in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated psychology behind the conspiracy she was unraveling. The true criminals had understood exactly how to exploit official assumptions, social conventions, and the village's natural tendency to accept dramatic explanations rather than examine uncomfortable truths about respected members of the community. The peaceful village slept on, unaware that its most dangerous residents were those who had learned to use their positions of trust and respectability as perfect camouflage for the most calculated forms of deception and murder. The evening following the dramatic discovery of James Ashworth's letter settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar quality of suspended tension that precedes the most significant revelations, when all the carefully constructed facades of civilized society stand poised to crumble under the weight of accumulated truth. Miss Marple had spent the quiet hours in methodical preparation, arranging her collected evidence with the precision of someone who understood that a single miscalculation could allow dangerous criminals to escape justice entirely. Her opportunity came when she received word that Cordelia had taken to her bed with what Dr. Pemberton described as nervous exhaustion brought on by the day's revelations. The timing struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient, particularly when she learned that the doctor had prescribed a special tonic to be administered that evening. Such solicitous care, while admirable in a medical professional, took on more sinister implications when viewed alongside the pattern of deception she had been unraveling. Determining to test her growing suspicions through direct observation, Miss Marple arranged an evening visit to Greenway House under the pretext of offering practical assistance during Cordelia's indisposition. She found the household in that state of hushed activity that accompanies illness, with Mrs. Hartnell moving about her duties with grim efficiency, while Dr. Pemberton maintained his vigil in the drawing-room. The scene that greeted her was carefully arranged, almost theatrical in its composition. Cordelia lay on the sofa with appropriate pallor, while Dr. Pemberton attended her with the sort of protective concern that spoke of intimate involvement rather than mere professional duty. On the side table stood a silver tray bearing a cut-glass decanter and 2 cordial glasses, the amber liquid within catching the lamplight with deceptive innocence. "Such a trying day for everyone," Miss Marple observed with gentle sympathy, while her sharp eyes conducted a systematic survey of the room's details. She noted the way Dr. Pemberton's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he prepared Cordelia's evening medication, the nervous glances he cast toward the window, and most tellingly, the faint medicinal scent that seemed to cling to his clothing. As she watched, Dr. Pemberton poured the tonic with practiced precision, but Miss Marple's trained observation caught something that would have escaped less experienced eyes. The doctor's movements, while appearing routine, included a subtle gesture. His fingers briefly concealed the glass's rim as he passed it to Cordelia, and she noticed the faintest trace of white powder clinging to his cuff. "Dr. Pemberton," she said with conversational casualness, "I do hope Mrs. Ashworth's condition isn't too serious. Such devoted care speaks well of your professional dedication, though I imagine the recent revelations have been distressing for everyone involved." His response revealed more than he intended. "Cordelia has endured considerable strain, Miss Marple. The accusations in James's letter, the implications about her conduct. It's enough to break anyone's constitution. She requires careful monitoring and, quite possibly, extended treatment away from the village's gossip and speculation." The suggestion of removing Cordelia from St. Mary Mead struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Someone planning to eliminate a potential witness might well arrange for their convenient disappearance under the guise of medical necessity. Choosing her moment with careful precision, Miss Marple spoke with the gentle, almost innocent tone that had served her so well in previous investigations, yet her words carried implications that only the guilty could fully comprehend. It's remarkable how certain circumstances can create such complex situations. Take, for instance, the matter of James's final weeks. One might assume his discovery of deception pointed toward marital discord, yet I suspect the truth involves professional matters rather than personal ones. Medical fraud, perhaps, or the systematic manipulation of a patient's condition for purposes having nothing to do with healing. The effect was immediate and revealing. Dr. Pemberton's composure, usually unshakable, showed distinct signs of strain. His grip tightened on his medical bag, and Miss Marple observed how his gaze flickered toward the French doors as though calculating escape routes. More significantly, she noticed how his hand moved instinctively to shield the prepared tonic from her view. Furthermore, she continued with inexorable gentleness, the missing documents, the forged evidence, even the damaged portrait, all represent attempts to create a narrative that would satisfy official investigation while concealing the true nature of the conspiracy. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household, combined with professional expertise and social respectability, would be perfectly positioned to orchestrate such elaborate misdirection. At that moment, Mrs. Hartnell entered with a tea tray, providing Miss Marple with the opportunity she had been seeking. In the brief confusion of rearranging the side table, she managed to exchange the prepared cordial glass with an identical one from the tray, a substitution accomplished with the deft precision of someone who had learned to notice and manipulate the smallest details. Dr. Pemberton's reaction to this seemingly innocent rearrangement was immediate and telling. His face drained of color as he realized what had occurred, and his hand moved instinctively toward the glass before he caught himself. The momentary lapse in his professional composure revealed more than hours of direct questioning might have accomplished. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, rising to take her leave, "that tomorrow might be an excellent time for a small gathering. Perhaps Inspector Slack could join us for tea, along with anyone else who might have insights into recent events. It's remarkable how much clarity emerges when all the interested parties can discuss matters openly." As she prepared to depart, Miss Marple noted the final telling detail that confirmed her suspicions. On Dr. Pemberton's medical case, partially concealed beneath his coat, was a small label bearing the name of a London pharmacy known for supplying rare medicinal compounds. The date on the label was recent, and the partial description visible included the words cardiac stimulant and concentrated solution. Walking home through the village in the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated psychology behind the conspiracy she had unraveled. The true criminals had understood exactly how to exploit professional respectability and social conventions as perfect camouflage for the most calculated forms of deception and murder. Tomorrow's gathering would provide the final test of her theories, when human nature would reveal itself under the gentle but inexorable pressure of truth. The peaceful village slept on, unaware that its most dangerous residents were those who had learned to use their positions of trust as weapons against the very people they were sworn to protect. The drawing room at Greenway House had been transformed into an intimate theater of justice, where the afternoon light cast long shadows across assembled faces that would soon reveal their deepest secrets. Miss Marple positioned herself near the damaged portrait, her knitting bag at her feet and her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the carefully arranged gathering. Inspector Slack occupied his official chair with renewed confidence, while Dr. Pemberton stood protectively near Cordelia, his medical bag conspicuously present and his manner suggesting a man prepared for swift departure if circumstances required it. Timothy Ashworth sat rigidly in the uncomfortable gilt chair, his usual petulance replaced by genuine apprehension, while Mrs. Hartnell and Colonel Bantry completed the assembly with that air of community judgment that Miss Marple had learned to use so effectively in her previous investigations. "I believe," Miss Marple began with gentle authority, "that we have been examining this case from entirely the wrong perspective. The destruction of James Ashworth's portrait was neither random vandalism nor family discord, but a carefully calculated attempt to conceal evidence of systematic murder and financial fraud." She moved closer to the fireplace, her slight figure commanding attention through quiet confidence rather than theatrical gesture. James Ashworth was murdered, not through poison or violence in the conventional sense, but through the deliberate manipulation of his cardiac condition by someone with intimate medical knowledge and unlimited access to his person. Dr. Pemberton's reaction was immediate but controlled. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. James died of natural causes, as I certified personally." "Indeed you did, Doctor. But I suggest that his heart condition was not naturally occurring but artificially induced through the systematic administration of cardiac stimulants over several months. The prescription bottle I observed at Mrs. Ashworth's side, the medicinal compounds you researched at our library, the London pharmacy label on your medical case, all point to someone with both the knowledge and opportunity to create a dependency that could be manipulated at will." Miss Marple turned to address the room with methodical precision. "James discovered this deception in his final weeks. The heated argument Mrs. Price overheard was his confrontation with you, Dr. Pemberton, about fraudulent medical practices and the systematic misappropriation of his funds. The visitor, who left through the garden carrying both medical case and envelope, was retrieving evidence that James had compiled and hidden behind his portrait. She gestured toward the slashed canvas above the mantelpiece. The portrait's destruction served multiple purposes. It allowed you to retrieve James's hidden documents while creating a dramatic crime that would focus attention on family disputes rather than medical fraud. The brass filings I discovered, the missing letter opener used to pry open the frame, the dark thread caught on the casement window, all evidence of someone who knew the household intimately and understood exactly where to find what they sought. Inspector Slack leaned forward with obvious interest. "You're suggesting Dr. Pemberton orchestrated this entire conspiracy?" The forged confession attributed to Timothy, the fabricated letter about marital discord. Both displayed the same distinctive handwriting characteristics, particularly the feminine flourish on the letter H that I observed in the doctor's own notes. These documents were designed to provide alternative motives that would satisfy official investigation while protecting the true criminal. Miss Marple's voice grew gentler but more inexorable. Most tellingly, when Mrs. Ashworth's potential testimony became a liability, you attempted to silence her permanently with a tonic that contained dangerous concentrations of digitalis. Your mistake was underestimating an old lady's tendency to notice when cordial glasses are exchanged during moments of confusion. The effect was immediate and devastating. Cordelia stared at Dr. Pemberton with dawning horror, her hand moving instinctively to her throat as though feeling the effects of months of subtle manipulation. The doctor's composure cracked entirely, his professional mask falling away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "You cannot prove intent," he said desperately. "Medical treatment involves calculated risks." "Perhaps not in a court of law, Doctor, but human nature reveals itself in the smallest details. Your protective concern for Mrs. Ashworth, your systematic elimination of evidence, your elaborate misdirection, all spoke of someone who had planned these crimes with meticulous care over many months." As Inspector Slack moved to make the arrest, Dr. Pemberton lunged toward the French doors, but Colonel Bantry and Timothy were already positioned to intercept him. The struggle was brief and undignified, ending with handcuffs and the reading of charges that would see justice done at last. In the aftermath, as the doctor was led away and arrangements made for Cordelia's medical treatment, the drawing room settled into stunned silence. The widow remained on the sofa, weeping softly as the full extent of her manipulation became clear. Timothy, though shaken, seemed to stand taller with the shadow of false accusation finally lifted from his shoulders. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness that only truly shocking revelations can achieve. The village, having been so eager to embrace simpler explanations, now grappled with the uncomfortable truth of evil hiding in plain sight, cloaked in professional respectability and social trust. A week later, life in St. Mary Mead had resumed its gentle rhythm, though with a new undercurrent of wariness. Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting in the pale autumn sunshine, reflecting on the eternal mystery of human nature. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned through long experience, were often those who held positions of greatest trust, using society's willingness to accept respectable facades as perfect camouflage for the most calculated forms of deception and murder. The peaceful village had indeed become the stage for sophisticated evil, but truth, like light through carefully drawn curtains, had found its way through the smallest gaps to illuminate the darkness that respectability could no longer conceal.